Hi, it's Heather, Business Development Lead for Co-operatives First. This webinar was recorded on March 16th, 2022, and our topic was Creative Solutions for Business Succession. I had a chance to interview Alison Anderson, CEO and founder of Succession Matching, and Dan Ohler, professional relationship coach and employee ownership specialist with Dan and Carol Ohler, Relationships by Design. I hope you enjoy this webinar.
In the same group said, thanks, Kyle. In terms of the question, what business would you want to buy? Almost everyone in our groups identified things like tourism experiences or, agriculture, small scale, something like that. It felt like the vibe felt very much like people wanted to spend less time in front of the computer. I realize it's ironic while I'm doing a webinar, and more time just like doing the things, more like a lifestyle business. So I think that there's some feelings in there that people would like to kind of shift and change their career, and maybe that will relate to some of the themes that we talk about. But without any further ado, welcome Allison and Dan to the panel. We're going to talk about getting creative with business succession and more. And so we're going to do something a little bit different with the introductions. I'm not going to introduce you. I'm going to let you introduce each other. And this wasn't my suggestion. This was Allison's suggestion. So I'm going to let Allison go first.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much for having us today. We like to do this internally because it gives us an opportunity to learn something neat about the other person. And I also think that my job's easier because if you guys haven't met Dan Ohler, he is a genuine rock star across the industry, especially in economic development. And he's definitely someone that I look up to. Many people from the co-op world know him because of the work that he's done since 2010 in doing co-op conversions. It really speaks to a lot of our backgrounds. I saw where a lot of the organizations that many people on this call are from, and it really is that rural communities coming together. They raised over $1 million to do some co-op conversions, and so I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that. I personally got to know Dan about 7 years ago through his work with ESOPs Canada. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ESOPs, it stands for Employee Share Ownership Plans. And I think his background is so unique because on our website, when people identify if they want to do a family transition or ESOP or a co-op, a lot of people actually don't know what the difference between an ESOP or a co-op. And I think Dan is probably Canada's expert on what the pros and cons of each are. Dan, I feel like I'm really teeing you up for the knowledge that we're going to gain from you today, but you are such a great resource for that. And at the end of the day, if you want to learn something from Dan, him and his wife, Carol, specialize in communication. I think this is so powerful because I know a lot of impasses that our rural communities come into, or even in economic development, comes down to some sort of communication as well. So not only just for individuals, but for businesses as well. So we're really fortunate to have Dan join us from Alberta.
Holy smoke. And I am incredibly honored to introduce Alison Anderson. Yes, I feel like I've known you for a long time, Allison. She is, some of the things I just admire so much about Allison is she's got this huge, big heart, and yet there's two sides of her. She's got the expertise in the data and the research and all of the knowledge that makes businesses work and that make business transitions work. And yet she's got this huge heart and wanting the best for everybody. Nothing's about Allison, it's always about you and how she can help you to create not just a sale of your business to somebody else, but how they can be the best deal where everybody wins. Not just a win-win, but a win-win-win-win. The win for the buyer, the win for the seller, the win for the employees, the win for the community. She sees it in a much bigger perspective. And so I just love succession matching, the business that you've developed, Allison. And boy, for the rest of you, make sure you pay attention and then go visit her website as well. It's just powerful stuff. And she knows everybody.
That was so nice. Thanks for suggesting that, Allison. And for both of you jumping in. I feel like everything I said, you were both like, yes, and it should be this. And you just kept one-upping everything I said, which is awesome. So you rose to kind of every thing I threw out and more. So let's get into our discussion. And you know what, I should say too, if you're thinking of doing a panel in the future, like that's a really good idea of if your panelists know each other, to get them to introduce each other. What a lovely thing. Anyway, so just a side note there. Okay, so we're going to talk about succession, and especially in the context of small business and rural businesses, because that's where most of us are coming from. So I want to start with Allison with my first question, and I want to ask you what you're observing in rural business succession right now. And I want to talk a little bit about how have things maybe changed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather. This is one topic that I'm very passionate about analyzing your data. So a little bit of context for everyone. About 12 years ago, I was working in economic development for Community Futures, and a plumber in our rural community wanted to sell his business and retire, but couldn't find a private and inexpensive way to do it. So he jumped into entrepreneurship. Over that last he came to my office. I couldn't find anything that would work for him. Then I jumped into entrepreneurship, and we've worked with thousands of transitions now over the last 10 years. So that context is important for this question, because we've been able to track our data from 10 years up until when the pandemic was declared, and there are so many different shifts. So the biggest one that we've seen is before 52% of our signups to our website were buyers and 48% sellers. Last year, we had 5 times as many buyers as sellers. And to your point earlier, Heather, like I think a lot of people are looking for change of career. They're reprioritizing some different things in their life. And a lot of people are getting interested in purchasing businesses. It was really neat to see the shift to rural. We saw this primarily on the website because we could see which communities people were interested in moving to. And it was a little bit fulfilling, because about 6 months later, Remax came out with a report about where home sales were happening. And so we were able to see that shift in people looking for businesses, then moving to those businesses in those communities once they purchased them. And so those have probably been our biggest changes in rural succession. But the other one that I want to highlight that we might talk a little bit later is the types of buyers have changed as well. Prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of Main Street buyers and sellers. They'd come to your Community Futures offices for loans. But now we're seeing a lot of what we call investor buyers. So mid-market mergers and acquisition firms are now looking at investing in smaller businesses. We just matched one to rural Saskatchewan. They're buying a cleaning company there and backing the employees to purchase it. And so it's been really neat to see some of those flexible transitions and really set the transitions up for success through that external capital as well.
Thanks, Alison. Dan, what are you seeing in terms of trends in business succession?
You mentioned something I think that's really important, Allison, about a little bit of a shift in where the businesses are going or where people are going. Something that we've seen, and I recall somebody telling me about a study that we're in a point where one of the only times in history where there's been a shift from the migration from rural to urban, and now that shift has changed where people are coming back to the rural areas for safety, for to be able to maybe buy something that they can have of their own. People, rather than our farms, well, that farms still continue to get bigger. However, we're seeing more people moving back and buying a quarter section or 20 or 30 acres and living out in a rural area and then doing something with it. So starting a business or taking over a business. And as much as the pandemic was an awful thing and continues to be, I think that there have been some real gifts that have come out of it as far as people maybe wanting to become more aware of how they live their life and their lifestyle rather than just making money. And also looking at ways that they can start or take over a business to own something rather than just being an employee, which is a part of why I think we're seeing more interest in the co-ops and the ESOP models as well.
So there's a question in the chat, and I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll just answer them as they come up. Or if we don't have time for the questions, then we'll answer them in an email later. But I think this will be a pretty quick one. So Allison, I think I'll just direct this at you. So what percentage are foreign buyers seeing opportunities? Just someone wants to ask that in the chat really quickly.
So we break our international buyers down into a few different categories. We primarily work with individuals going through the provincial nominee programs. And so that percentage has changed quite a bit in the last 12 months because BC's paused their program. The year before that, PEI paused their program. New Brunswick launched a new program in January. And we're doing a lot of work in this area right now with displaced Ukrainians to purchase businesses as more of an emergency measures. So quite a high increase. We also work with Fragelman, which is the largest immigration firm in the world. And they have very specific source countries that the buyers come from. So our percentage of foreign buyers is probably a lot higher than most, just due to the nature of some of our relationships. So I don't have an exact number, but if you let me know which province you're interested in, I could break that down based on area of interest.
Just as an example of that, our community of Sangudo is really 3/4 of an hour from White Court and Spruce Grove, Edmonton area where there's lots of population. And historically, our area real estate has been very low in price and very rural and not many people moving here. Just recently, we've had a bunch of land and businesses that are being bought up, and a lot of the money is coming from Asia as well.
So a quick note on Alberta's program. So they only have the farm stream, and then the provincial government last year announced that they were going to have 3 different streams. So they've announced 2 of them. One's more tech geared, one's more student geared. And we're hoping the 3rd one that they launch is more of a traditional entrepreneurship stream where they can buy the small businesses as well. But ag and ag value add is certainly a path in Alberta that a lot of people go down. Sorry.
Again, no, that's fantastic. I'm glad you put that in because this is exactly why I wanted the 2 of you to speak today. Okay, so again, if you have any questions as they occur to you, put them in the chat and we'll get to them if we have time in our discussion here. So I want to talk a little bit more about, actually we were already talking about this, but I wanted to dig into this a little bit more because I think there's more to dig here. The hole's deeper. What are some of the drivers of change? We talked about the increase in the buyers and a little bit about why that might be, but let's spend a little bit of time speculating here. So it's informed speculation, we'll call it. What are some of those drivers of change? And how are they kind of like, like there's some big world trends going on that we've seen here. So what's going on? Like, why is this happening? And then, I think the question then allows us to say like, okay, what can we do with that information? Like, how can we use that? So Dan, I'll start with you.
So I think some of the drivers of change, one is that people want to have a little bit more control of their own lives. And business is a way that you can do that. Although, depending on the size of the business, there's a lot of controls that may seem sort of outside of yourself. However, I think that there's kind of an accountability where people are saying, life is short. I want to do some of these things that I maybe haven't been able to do before. Because of the pandemic, some people lost their jobs, which was maybe a good thing in some cases because it gave them an opportunity to invest or to do something that they've always wanted to do, and which is, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing a bit of a migration out to the rural areas. I think also it's a way there's a desire to work together. Many people don't understand what community is or don't know what community is, and yet out in our rural communities we have that, and maybe we've taken it for granted to a large degree in the past. And yet there's a desire to work together and to include others and to be able to care for others, and maybe even some partnering, whether it be in business or just in how we live our lives. Through the pandemic, volunteer organizations almost shut down, and yet now there's, people have been opening up and getting together again, and there just seems to be a real desire to reinvigorate community.
Thanks, Dan. I also feel the same sort of vibe happening, because it's almost like you don't know what you have until it's gone. And then you realize, oh, actually, we really had something there. There was a real community there, and we value that. And so we want to work at it now. Not like it wasn't working before, but there's a recognition there. And I think that's really interesting. And I think the resurgence of community is something that we should all be looking towards. Allison.
I'm going to flip this question and focus primarily on the attendees of this workshop. And one of the drivers of change that we're seeing across the board that I think a lot of people can tap into is the lack of financing for individuals going to chartered banks or even BDC to finance their transition. So I'm going to break this down into two parts. So the first part is like across my desk, I see term sheets every single day on the financing terms to purchase the business for the buyers on our platform. And during the pandemic, it was so alarming because some of the charters or some of the other lenders were charging like 13% or asking for 6 times personal guarantees on these smaller loans, which is, in my opinion, almost predatory lending. So if you work for Community Futures, the reason why this is super important as a subject for you is because you can fill that gap and you can be that financing for business transitions in your community. On the flip side, if you're an economic development officer and you're looking at how can you keep some of these businesses alive, co-op conversion might be the solution there, because it is an alternative way to transition and provide that financing, because the charters just aren't lending to business transitions. And that scares me for our entire economy as a whole.
I think that's
Can
really
I add to
interesting.
that a little bit as well?
Of course. Go ahead, Dan.
I believe that money is never the problem. It's about how do we find it and access it and have people feel good about where they're investing their money. And I totally agree with what Alison was just sharing about the co-op conversions and about the chartered banks being a little resistant or even backing away from investing. I get calls daily from people who are primarily in rural communities where their communities are struggling and the businesses are struggling, and yet the people are willing to work together and invest in each other's businesses. And these opportunity development co-ops and worker co-ops are just a magical way to make these transitions happen in an effective way. And it's about patient capital, because in your own community with one of these co-op models, people, you can collect money, and rather than the conventional bank saying you're going to pay 13% interest and here we need all of these guarantees. Instead, because these are people in your community that you like, that you trust, people are willing to invest in them because of their dedication, their passion, and what they hold. And they're also willing to be kind of coaches, for lack of better terms, because where the more we could tie into the social capital of what people in our community know, one person who invests in the co-op and helps the business, they're a marketing person, and so they can give some ideas and some suggestions that way. Another person might be a finance genius, so they can help in that way, and it ties in and helps the business in so many bigger ways than a conventional bank would ever do. And people aren't expecting the huge income. Maybe they're not going to get a return for a couple of years, but then it'll start to dribble in. It's not get rich quick. Maybe it's not even get rich slow, but it's about supporting each other.
Thanks, both of you, for identifying that. And I think I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm going to ask a question that's going to kind of support what we were talking about here, because I think a lot of people listening will say, how do we, what are we doing about this? And I think there's a few points to start with. Okay, so the one thing I wanted to ask is now about an example of a creative way to transition a business that you've seen, and why does it stick with you so much? Okay, so Alison, do you want to take this one first?
I think I'll use the example that I was just referencing with some investment capital out of Toronto. This was almost 2 years in the making. So as some of you may know, on this webinar, we're partners with Community Futures Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So any businesses or buyers in your community can access our site and services free of charge. And then Community Futures Manitoba and Saskatchewan also sponsored formal succession plans. And so we had a rural carpet cleaning business go through the formal succession plan process. We were able to identify in that process that there was 2 employees that were interested in taking ownership in the company. They couldn't access the capital because they were new immigrants to the country and their credit portfolio was a little bit more thin. And then we had an investor buyer that complemented their skills. And so they've partnered together. They were able to get a Community Futures loan, and they're in the process of doing the letter of intent together. And it just tied everything up in a bow. Like it's not a short process by any means, but it was really cool that we've got new Canadians, we've got investor buyers, we've got the Community Futures involved. And then the sellers actually prepared and doing a mentorship period. And I can honestly see this business growing in over 100% profit just from putting this team together, because they always outsource part of the restoration work, which they can now bring internally with some of the staff's skills. And the investor buyer has a lot of marketing skills. The business doesn't have a website. So it's just, this was one of those things where I just like, it was really cool to see come to fruition, and I was super proud of my team for putting it together.
Thanks, Allison. Dan, what do you think?
I have a couple examples I can give. In our own community, there was a restaurant that was providing, I mean, it was an amazing facility. It was, restaurant, coffee shop. It was kind of a community gathering place, and where a lot of meetings happened, both formal and informal. They did murder mysteries and musical events and all kinds of great stuff like that. But when the pandemic hit, of course, everything shut right down. And unfortunately, the entrepreneur wasn't able to stay open and closed the business. The landlord was able to find another person who came in and operated the commercial kitchen. This entrepreneur started a frozen business, a frozen dinner business, where she's marketing and selling frozen dinners to people primarily in the Edmonton area and delivering them to them door to door. And perfect, because people weren't going out to restaurants. She was able to use the kitchen, start this business, and it's just been a fabulous thing. And the landlords, in order to help this entrepreneur get going, they gave her really reasonable terms. The entrepreneur was paying the utilities for the building, no rent, but then gradually over the months, the rent started to increase a little bit, but the business grew and grew, and it's just flourishing right now. And again, a lot of local support to make that work. Another example, one that I'm working with now, it's a craft brewery, and they were struggling. And however, some innovative things that they did is they went from what traditionally was keg sales into restaurants and bars and things. And all of a sudden they were taking orders from people in their community and delivering from the brewery right to their door. And also so moving more towards cans and bottles that people were appreciating now. They've also just are in the process of transitioning where the employees are buying into the business as an ESOP as well. So great community story.
Nice. Okay, so the last question that I wanted to ask, and the reason I wanted to ask you to share these specific examples, because I think it's better to kind of like, if you have an example and then you looked at it, you're like, okay, I could see how this and this and this and this were all very important ways of making this business, stick around or to expand or to do more different business or whatever, to pivot. And I think like maybe some people, just because like I'm the co-op person or whatever, I'll just say like, okay, my answer here is going to be like start a co-op. No, that's not my answer. I think because people start co-ops, and I think what we're talking about here is we're talking about people. And Allison's example and Dad's example is when people all decided like, this is a priority for us to make this happen. So we're going to work together and sort of lean into our strengths individually to like make this happen. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of cultivating that mindset. I don't know, like, is that the kind of, I think the direction that I want to take it? I mean, I mean, initially I said, how do we get a Dan Ohler in every community in Western Canada? Because that's really what would, you know, we need somebody to, like, I think what, you know, every sort of at the center of this is there's somebody championing this at the center of every initiative. There's someone just saying like, okay, let's pull a team together and make this work. So I don't know. What does it take, I guess, to think outside the box when it comes to business succession? What does it take to cultivate that sort of thought in a town or a community? I mean, is there a way to do that? And maybe lead by example is the answer. And I'm sorry if that was a confusing question, but Dan, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I will. And I think the first key part to this, something that a lot of economists and our government don't understand, is that people do not live in an economy, they live in community. So it's about how to have people work together. And your point is exactly correct. It's about finding a champion or some champions. Now, my experience in our own community and in working with many communities to start these opportunity development co-ops is that you need more than one. You know, you need a handful, at least 3, 4, 5, 6 people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and work together, volunteer some time, and really have a good look at the community and what's needed, and then be willing to support each other to bring a few more people together to make it important. And as you said before, to prioritize what's really important in the community. You know, for one person to take it on, sometimes egos get in the way, and more importantly than that, I think that there are always some naysayers. And so if I'm excited about something and I happen to bump into somebody who's a naysayer, knocks the wind out of my sails, and I might run away with my tail between my legs. However, when I've got 2 or 3 or 4 other people who are passionate as well, then we're able to buoy each other up and expand, and the energy grows exponentially.
And I'm going to rephrase this question too, because I've had a minute to think about how confusing it was. And it was a great answer, Dan. Thank you for that. But I wanted to ask Allison, like, in your experience from the places that you've seen, all of these successions all over Canada, where and what kind of places do these happen successfully? Is there something you've noticed? Are there trends and themes you say like, okay, when you have this and this and this, then, you know, you kind of have your recipes for success?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of Dan's answer and try to address that question. A very well articulated question, may I add. I think the first thing is, how do you cultivate it is education. So I want to congratulate everyone for attending today, because just by the nature of being curious and seeing what's out there, I think that goes a long way. And this is one area that I go out on such a soapbox for when it comes to business transition, because the thing that drives me nuts about economic development is smokestack chasing. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, it's when economic development looks to bring the next shiny object. So when Amazon announced their second headquarters, everyone and their dog put together a program to bring them to, like, I'm going to even pick on the city of Winnipeg. They put in a bid, and Amazon's minimum requirement was a population of 1 million people. So if you don't meet the minimum requirement, why are you allocating resources? So the number one thing that you can do to help business succession and how you can find success in your community is figure out what your own differential proposition is of your community and really lean into that. So my example of the business that I would look to buy would be something in tourism in the Great Lakes, because there's an economic opportunity with Viking cruises coming in. They've got these really cool like anchors that use GPS instead of an actual anchor, so it doesn't disrupt any of the biodiversity on the bottom of the lakes. And so they can anchor in these small ports that like had never been able to bring in tourism from the water. So there's just going to be this huge boom. So what do you have in your community's backyard that you can lean into, and those key services in your community that really makes it feel like your home? I love that quote, Dan, that we don't live in economies, we live in communities. So figure out what's in your backyard. Don't chase the Amazon headquarters. Don't chase the game development like the city of Calgary did, unfortunately. figure out what's special about your backyard.
I think another key piece that ties into that, Allison, and we're really fortunate with the people who are attending this, is the knowledge and the skills and the resources that Community Futures has. I think that they are a powerful organization in all of our, especially our rural communities. You know, they're able to provide the training and the guidance and not to do it for the entrepreneurs, but to help them, to show them the way and tap them in to resources that many of us don't know are there, and to provide, you know, the funding if that is necessary as well.
Yes, for anyone who's joining from Community Futures, thanks for coming. And also just a huge shout out to all the work that Community Futures are doing. And like Allison said, I mean, that being that source of financing where banks are not lending is a huge opportunity right there. So exciting times. Okay, so that was the last question that I had for the panel. And is there any other questions that are coming from Q&A? You know what, I was sort of feeling like it was a bit funny as we were talking, because I was like, here we are talking about business transitions, and it was like some of the key themes emerging are community, which I was like, I wouldn't have necessarily connected those dots as being like the key into, you know, factor. It's like, but here we are, and I think, like, you know, maybe that's my lens and the lens of our panelists, but I do believe there is a connection there. So I think that's really cool. And the other thing is, you know, the panelists are free to connect afterwards if people are curious or have questions, specific information you want to know from the panelists about their organizations, what the work that they do, or their experience. You know, feel free. I'll send out an email afterwards with some contact information if that's okay. To everyone who came. Okay, cool. So the last thing before we go is to just say a big thank you to our panelists for being here and for talking to us about business succession, transition, what's going on, and sharing their expertise and knowledge and spending this hour with us. So I want to thank you so much, and for bringing that positive energy, because I think, like, this is leading by example here, that both of them are the kind of people, like I said, when I asked them a question, they said, yes, sure, let's do that. And then Allison added something in and said, okay, let's do this kind of introduction. And then I think Dan, who suggested there was going to be a sing off? I don't know, whatever. So there's just, we kept going, we kept riffing, yes, and. And I think, like, this is the essence of an interesting project, that when you come in on something, and even when you come in something on your community, if you have people there who are like, you know, just not doctor no, you know, you sort of yes and, and then you keep going, and who knows if you can accomplish it or not. I mean, who knows, but you know, you can try. So I think that both of them just sort of embody that characteristic, and that's why they're, you know, they're here today, and they're so successful at what they do. So big thanks for that. So before we close off here, I want to give a chance for us to go back into our breakout rooms for a little bit more time to connect individually. And so the question that I had for everyone is, you know what, I just wanted to think about a business in your town, community, area that, you know, maybe I wanted you to bring us something that maybe kind of stuck on. Okay, so is there a different way that you could think about this problem? Could you approach it from a different way? Is there a business that's going to be sold in the future, or is, you know, potentially at risk of loss, or something going on, or a gap in your community, like a thing that you're like, this really could work here, but we just don't have a way to make it happen? So is there something that sort of occurred to you while we've been talking that was like, I might be able to think about this a little bit differently, or even just present the problem, like, we really need this, we don't know how to get it, and maybe other people in your session can help you. Okay, so, and if people have to dial off, that's totally fine too. I know, you know, it's a quick hour here today. So that's what we're going to do for our breakout rooms. Kyle's going to put us in them, and then we'll wrap up in about, you know, less than 10 minutes here.